The organization Human Rights Watch says the abuse of women by the Taliban government in Afghanistan amounts to crimes against humanity. Women have been told they can no longer take part in higher education, they cannot work in most jobs, they can't even go to one of the country's main national parks. Heather Barr is an Associate Director for the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Heather, good afternoon to you. How has life changed for women since the Taliban took over the government in Afghanistan?
So life was pretty difficult for women in Afghanistan before the Taliban took over in August 2021, but since then it's changed in unimaginable ways. Women and girls have lost most of their rights. First, the Taliban banned girls from attending secondary education. Later on, they banned women and girls from higher education as well. They've banned women from most types of employment outside of the home. They've restricted women's freedom of movement so much that it's very, very difficult for women to even go to a job or to school if they're allowed to have one. This has resulted in things like women not having access to medical care. The Taliban have beaten and arbitrarily detained and tortured women's rights protesters who've tried to oppose these policies. And that's really just the beginning of a list which continues to grow day by day, including some of the recent abuses that you've mentioned.
I suppose what this does is that it forces women to be dependent on men. If a woman can't work, she's dependent on the man, and a man that she may be married to, but maybe didn't have much choice in that either.
No, that's absolutely right. And another thing I didn't mention before is that one of the first things the Taliban did after they took over was systematically and intentionally dismantle all of the systems that have been put in place to deal with gender-based violence in Afghanistan. So a system of shelters, system of services, legal assistance, specialized prosecution units, specialized courts, all of that was wiped out pretty much overnight, as well as the Taliban also abolishing the Ministry of Women's Affairs and the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission.
Is there anything the rest of the world can or should be doing about this?
Yeah, absolutely. In our view, the response by the international community has been really poor. It's not an easy situation. There aren't any easy solutions, but there are solutions. And what I think the international community is failing to grasp is that this crisis has global implications. If we don't have a response that really stands by Afghan women and girls, then we're lowering the bar dramatically on the situation for women's rights everywhere. So happy to tell you about some of the things the international community should be doing, if you've got a moment.
Well, we do. I mean, South Africa, for example, we say that we have particular values. Our Minister of International Affairs has suggested that she wants to think that our values are universal values. Our values are in huge conflict with the Taliban. So a South African government, if they're in any kind of engagement with the government in Afghanistan, what should we be saying to them?
So I think a lot of people actually are looking to South Africa in particular for leadership on this situation. And some of the things that countries can be doing include at the Human Rights Council, which began its latest session yesterday. We're asking for countries to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Afghanistan, but also to create a new UN-mandated mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of the crimes that are being committed in Afghanistan, such as the crime of gender apartheid. At the Security Council, there's an important process going on where the UN is in the process of putting together an assessment on the international response to Afghanistan. That's due by November 17th. And one of the concerns about that is whether it's really going to pay attention to human rights or whether it's going to focus more on engaging with the Taliban around issues like security and business deals. So there's a lot of room for countries like South Africa to really be champions of Afghan women and stand by them in this incredibly difficult moment.
Well, I was going to come to that. There's huge debate in countries like the United States about whether they should engage with the Taliban or not, whether they should engage with what is now, de facto at least, the government of Afghanistan about issues like security. I imagine for Pakistan this is a huge issue. Should countries be negotiating? I mean, the United States will say, perhaps, or some people in the United States might say, that they need to negotiate, need to discuss security. Can you discuss security without talking about the rights of women?
Well, you shouldn't. You shouldn't discuss anything with the Taliban without discussing the rights of women. And it often feels like it's a bit of a throwaway in those conversations, that diplomats sort of say women's rights and then move on to what they really want to talk about. And the point that Afghan women's rights defenders have been making is that, they keep hearing arguments that it's really important to engage with the Taliban and engage, but we're 2 years down the track, and that engagement certainly hasn't yielded anything with regard to improving the situation for women and girls. In fact, that situation keeps getting worse. So there's a lot of discussion now about what principled engagement would look like, where sure, you have to talk to the Taliban to do things like try to stem the extraordinarily serious humanitarian crisis that's happening in the country, but you need to do it in ways that doesn't normalize, legitimize, and recognize them.
There are other issues to this. You used a phrase, I think you used it deliberately, gender apartheid. And of course, that has a particular resonance here. We remember how the rest of the world, many countries imposed sanctions, not all of them, but many of them imposed sanctions on South Africa because of its form of racial apartheid. Should countries be doing that based on gender? It's the same thing, really, isn't it?
So the Special Rapporteur on the human rights situation in Afghanistan and the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls issued a report in June where they used that term, and they called for a report by states to explore what type of framework could exist or should exist to deal with a situation like Afghanistan. And that's one of the questions that we'll be watching for as we watch this session of the Human Rights Council, is whether that recommendation and the other recommendations from that very important report are taken up or not.
It gets quite complicated. I think most people, I would certainly agree that we should take some form of action against Afghanistan. In the real world of international diplomacy, things could get a bit more complicated because the Taliban's not the only government that does things like this. Iran is currently, their parliament, in secret session I understand, is going to debate whether or not to tighten rules around what women must wear in public, a hijab to cover their hair. In France, they're going the other way. They're trying to say that women are not allowed to wear certain things. Should governments just get out of trying to control what women wear in the first place?
Absolutely, and my organization has spoken out repeatedly about the situation in Iran and also the situation in France. We certainly take the view that these are all infringements on women's rights, whether you're telling them to wear more or to wear less, and that these are all violations of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which virtually every country has signed up for, including those three.
Heather Barr, thank you, Associate Director for the Women's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Really appreciate the time.